All right, hello everybody. Thank you to all 10 of you for coming. I'm going to give a short talk about open source. Just a quick, it doesn't matter if you don't know open source, but does anybody here do a little bit of work in open source? There's a hand in the back room there on the phone. Thank you for joining. So this is going to be a short talk about how I think that we can make open source a little bit better. My name is Charlotte. I'm at Charlotte is on Twitter, on GitHub, and basically everywhere. Currently a developer for Marks & Spencer Digital, doing a lot of stuff like front end and also Python and a little bit of project management as of last week. I'm also a member of Hoodie.js, an offline first open source JavaScript framework. I mainly deal with community accessibility stuff though. Just became a member of Node Together, trying to educate underrepresented members of the community to teach them Node. And I'm also the creator of Your First PR, which is an open source initiative to get people interested in open source. And that probably doesn't make sense, but we'll get onto it later. So I've mentioned the term open source a couple of times, so before we get any further, I should probably define what I mean by that. The cool kids over at opensource.org define it as software that can be freely used, changed and shared in modified or unmodified form by anyone. Generally a good definition, but I disagree that open source is software that can be freely used, changed and shared by anyone, because I believe that open source caters to a specific subgroup of people, generally white cis men, but also people with particular resources like time and the energy to actually contribute, because it does take a lot of time and energy. Internet connection, we all might be sitting in our little cool agencies at DeskBeers with our high-speed internet. The internet is very good here, but not everybody has internet, or people have slow internet. Little experience of harassment, again going back to the men thing. A lot of underrepresented members of tech who come into open source do experience harassment. I've experienced harassment myself. It is a thing, it happens. And employment, if you're going to work for free, you're probably going to need a job and some money to actually afford to be able to work for free, and a lot of people don't have that. But I'm not going to be negative. This is a positive talk about how we can make open source better. I'm going to go through about 4 or 5 small but impactful things that we can do to improve our open source projects, to make the open source community more accessible, approachable, inclusive, and just a happier experience. The first one is one of the most important, and that is a code of conduct. A code of conduct in my GitHub projects, and I will talk about GitHub here, but any sphere of open source applies. It is a set of guidelines to say what is and isn't acceptable behavior in your project, such as no sexist language, no homophobia, no racism, etc. The code of conduct back in 4 years ago used to be good to each other, but we have bigger kind of documents that will actually outline what is and isn't acceptable. This is a little bit controversial still, not so much now, but 2 years ago when people say code of conduct, you get certain people go like, what about my free speech? I want to work in open source openly and be able to say whatever the heck I want. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about counter arguments to this, but I got tired. So my general argument is, if you cannot come into my project and act nicely, then your free speech can be taken elsewhere. A code of conduct is not a catch-all though. Just because you have a document in your GitHub repo saying be good to each other, it doesn't mean that people are suddenly going to be good to each other. That's not how the world works. If it did, then we'd be in a nicer society, but we ain't. But rather it's a pledge by project contributors and maintainers to say, to the best of our ability, within the sphere of this project, we will try and protect each individual contributor as best as we can. There are some good open source code of conducts like the Contributor Covenant by Coral and Ada. And for your more conference event-based things like DeskBeers, for example, there is the Conf Code of Conduct written by, maintained by Remy Sharp. So if you came to me at the pub after this in about 15 minutes after buying me a G&T, and you say, Charlotte, should I get a code of conduct? I'd be like, yeah, totally, get one. But read it first. There's no point having this lovely document that says all these nice things if you don't actually know what you're signing up to. And keep it updated as well. If you're using one of the open source code of conducts like Contributor Covenant and Conf Code of Conduct, they actually, because they're open source projects, they get a lot of updates. Most of my pull requests last year in December were updating projects like Node and Rust because they'd missed out crucial parts to do with gender identity, which is very important to me, and I didn't feel like I could put in the effort to contribute to those projects until I knew that all the bases were covered as far as I knew what the bases were. most importantly, you need to be prepared to deal with problematic behavior. Having a project without a code of conduct is less harmful than a project with a code of conduct that aren't prepared to do anything about it. If I come to a project that pretends to be able to protect me and then they don't, that's much more detrimental than me coming to a project that I know hasn't subscribed to doing anything good for me. And if this doesn't convince you, Ash Dryden writes amazing things on everything. They are a lovely, lovely person, and they've written a 101 and an FAQ that should cover all the questions that you have a code of conduct, should you wish to learn more. The second most important, if not slightly as important as a code of conduct, is a Readme. And yours might look a little bit like this. So welcome to Unicorn.js. To use Unicorn.js, you need to install Node. NPM comes for free with that. You install the Node package and then you write the Unicorn. Done, right? Not really. A Readme is potentially the only opportunity you have to entice someone to use your project and keep them coming back for more to contribute. So my ideal Readme looks a little bit like this. Welcome to Unicorn.js, home of unicorns. Unicorn.js is a Node module that helps you to ride unicorns. If you're going to partake in Unicorn.js in any form, then we do expect you to adhere to our code of conduct, which you can read more about here. And then you can get onto the hello world. So you install Node, you install the package, you ride the unicorn. If you're anything like me, a hello world doesn't really cut it these days, so I need more information. So you can link to some tutorials like a blog post or a book or a video or what have you. People get stuck, it happens, so people need to know where to go for help, be it a mailing list or a Discus forum or a Slack channel or IRC channel, point them to where they go. And if it's a GitHub issue that you want them to open, tell them how to do it. GitHub have recently created issue templates that you can put into the root of your project. So when they create an issue, all the information can be, not pre-filled, but suggested. So what version of OS X are you using? What version of Node are you using? Like, help the contributors to help you, because I go through hundreds of issues a week and they are all very different and they are all terrible in their own right. So if you follow my process, then everything is fine. And then because you're an open source project, you need help, right? So now you can be like, hey, if you want to help us build a 4x4 all-terrain unicorn, then help us ship this feature. And last but definitely not least, how do people get in touch with you privately? I do believe that open source should be conducted 99.9% of the time in public, but there are certain sensitive things that people might need to tell you about. So I generally recommend having an email that you check for things like code of conduct violations, or someone who's a little bit nervous and new to programming and kind of want to ask you questions but don't really feel confident doing that in a public format yet. Having an email address where they can do that is really beneficial. So that's my Readme. I briefly mentioned telling people how to file a GitHub issue. So I will talk a little bit about issues. So as Adam mentioned, I did a talk at LRUG recently about your first pull request. Your first pull request being a accidental project that I started at the end of last year that kind of blew up, where I post tweets, because that's generally all I do is post tweets. If you know me in this room, you know that's what I do. But this is another Twitter account. I have 4 now, I think, where I post GitHub issues that I believe to be approachable for a beginner to open source, but also, depending on the complexity of the issue, beginners to program as a tool. Because I do believe that open source is a fantastic place to learn. I've only been a programmer for less than 2 years. So when it comes to September, I'll have been a programmer for 2 years. And one of the first things I did was go to GitHub and look at projects. And that's how I became a part of Hoodie. And now I'm one of their core contributors. So here's an issue I prepared on January the 23rd. The Hoodie website still has a number of accessibility problems. So I opened some issues to get people, as is the nature of open source, to help me. So if we look at the title, the first word we see is accessibility. So we already know what the subject matter is, which can be achieved by labeling as well. And then I go on to explain the solution rather than the problem. So the thing I want to achieve is I want to give the Hoodie logo meaningful alternative text. In the issue description, I explain why I want to do that, because people using screen readers like OS X VoiceOver may not understand the purpose of that logo in the document. The logo links to the homepage, so we should say that it links to the homepage. So I tell them how to do that by claiming the issue so nobody else works on it, because duplicate work can, slow things down. And then I tell them which Jekyll templates will add the alternative text to, so they don't really have to go searching, they just know what to do, they can do the thing, and then they can copy or paste it into the other templates, and they've achieved something. I've also suggested a commit message. In Hoodie we use semantic release, so they should follow particular conventions. So that will just make it easier for me to merge their story if it reaches all the requirements. And if they get stuck, they can reach out to me on Slack, which also includes private communication like DMs, or Twitter, or they can talk on the GitHub issue itself. Make good use of labels as well. When you have a project, for example, like Node, that has like thousands of people creating issues like it broke, fix it. Labels can be used by maintainers to kind of pinpoint what the topic is about. This is a bug, so I use the bright red bug label, generally convention across projects. I'm also actively seeking help. Not all issues in your project you're actually going to want help with. So saying you actually want help is a really good indication that I'm not going to waste my time doing something. And starter issue, we don't use in Hoodie anymore because we have a separate repo for all our starter issues, but I still use this to just say, if this is your first experience with this GitHub project, here's a really good place to get started. And here's how you can learn about the code base and become part of the community in a small and less scary way. In order to do good code of conducts, readmes, and GitHub issues, we have to think about the language that we use, because if we're not using good language, we could do the most amazing illustrative readme, but if it doesn't actually, if it isn't inclusive and helpful, then you've wasted a lot of time. So the most important thing about writing, very difficult to do, is make sure everything you write is clearly worded. The Government Digital Service have written an amazing style guide in which they recommend that we write for about a year, a reading age of about 9 years old, because I might be, can I swear?
Yeah.
I might be shit hot at programming, but I might not be able to understand your documentation. If you're using big fancy words, as us programmers tend to do, that can be confusing. If you can say it using 3 words, say it using 3 words. Don't go on a tirade about object inheritance and communism or whatever you're doing. And now I'm going to go on not a rant, but something very dear to my heart is gendered language. So I mentioned a couple of times already that society as a whole, and by association programming and by association open source, caters to more of a kind of manly mindset. I can't think of a good word. Let's go with manly. So I encounter a lot of examples in documentation that use he and him. Like he made the car object, whatever. Also, side note, please stop using cars to describe object inheritance. It doesn't make sense to anybody. Use actual... Nobody drives cars in London, for example, okay? Like I don't drive a car, so I'm not gonna... Just think of something different, like cats or something. So, he and him, don't like it. To offer an alternative, a lot of people do use she and her. I do slightly prefer this because, equaling the balance and all that, but not everybody in the world is she and a her either. I don't define as he or she, so when I see documentation referring to either of those things, I'm like, I know that you're not trying to exclude me, but make a little bit more effort. So consider gender neutral language. My pronouns are they and them, so it makes me happy to see this, but it also, if you stop assuming something about your audience, you'll include more people. The moment you start to assume things about your audience, like, oh, the only people using my project are men who like beer, right? No, lots of people want to use your project, so just be inclusive. Just be inclusive, it's not that easy, but we can try together. Avoid phrases like, hey guys. I know that a lot of people say that it's gender neutral now, it's totally a thing, but to some people it isn't, so try and not use it. Use things like, hey everyone, hey folk, hey computer people, hey beer drinkers, or whatever. But language is hard, and it takes a really long time to assimilate those things. In Hoodie, we've created some commands for Slackbot to be a little bit, remind us to be inclusive of the language. So if I say, hey guys, they say perhaps you meant comrades. Again, communism is a theme. If I use ableist language like crazy, they were like, do you mean strange or awesome or weird or fantastic? Little things like that. It certainly helped the more core contributors of Hoodie to be more mindful of the language. Programming Slackbot is the only time I've mentioned programming in this slide deck, because I don't believe that code is an important part of open source. You've written your unicorn riding node module, and it might be brilliant and amazing. You never have to have a bug report. No PRs need to be done. It's just amazing. You have your unicorn, you're fine. But what about the other stuff? Like, how do people find out about your project? Who writes your newsletters? Like, assuming that your unicorn project has gotten a little bit larger, if it hasn't, you don't really need to worry about these things so much, but newsletters and your unicorn graphics, and who moderates your communities, like those Slack channels that you've opened for support, who makes sure that your documentation is clearly worded. Like, it doesn't, one person can't do all of these things, so if you've reached enough traction, it might be time to start a team of people who do this. Which is exactly what we did at Hoodie. So myself and a few of my colleagues at Hoodie, like Jan and Gregor and Jen, we started the Hoodie editorial team, which was an idea that I think Gregor mentioned to me like a year ago, and I went, yeah, that's amazing. I didn't realize how important this would end up being. The editorial team kind of drives the everyday of Hoodie now. It's their ideas and their perseverance that really help us. We're close to shipping 1.0 now because of them, and they're amazing. So if you don't really want to do any programming in open source, you want to take a break, you want to learn more about writing, we are looking for people all the time, because open source people don't stay for very long. So if you want to write some stuff, please join the editorial team. If you haven't paid attention to any of this talk, which is fine, I rarely pay attention to talks. I did pay attention to yours though, don't worry. It was great. But I find it difficult to pay attention to things. So if you take one thing away from this, nothing about open source is important apart from you, because you are the people that drive open source. You are the people who put your blood, sweat and tears and beer dregs into, I'm trying to be relevant to DeskBeers, right? So you just need to remember that you are important. Your project isn't going to die because you decided to take a weekend off, play Pokemon Go. Because burnout is real. I wrote the blog post that before this talk, once I was burnt out. I wrote this talk when I was burnt out. I gave it in Scotland when I was burnt out. And if you ask me in about 10 minutes, Charlotte, do you think you're burnt out? I wouldn't be able to say no, because I spend a lot of time putting everything into the things that I love, and I love open source. And open source burns people out. I've seen it 100 times. I will see it 100 times more. You don't really know when you're burnt out, but if you start to take breaks before you get burnt out and play Pokemon Go or hang out with your kids or whatever normal people do, then just be mindful is what I'm trying to say. Like, look after yourself, sleep, take more naps, because open source is going to be there forever, and you won't be if you don't sleep a bit more. Because I want us to all be happy animals wearing hoodies and eating marshmallows by a campfire. That is the end of my talk. I wrote, the precursor to this talk is about a 2,000 word blog post. I like to ramble, where I go into more detail. There's more sections about how I think we can improve open source. And my slides are at the second link there. There's not much to them, but maybe you want to, I don't know, read them anyway. Thank you for inviting me.